let's start with the most tactile part of this problem. In the common cultural practice of male circumcision, so cutting off the foreskin from the penis, especially commonly done in the United States of America, especially commonly done in the Islamic faith and in Judaism. I've seen ballpark estimates in articles that maybe 50% of the nerve endings in your penis are lost. But those numbers, whether the particular author says 50% or 30%, they're a little bit misleading because, as Eric Clopper discusses at some length in his new YouTube video, it's the 50% of nerve endings that really count. Whether you count as 50% or 30%, if it's 30%, it's 30% that are located at the end of the penis that really matters in terms of your perception or your experience of sexuality. Now, of course, it's also in a structural sense destroying the shape and function of the penis. So there's more to be said about what the impacts are of male circumcision just on how men have sex. But in terms of how we perceive the world, how we see and feel, Eric Clopper, in his new video titled Sex and Circumcision, American Love Story, he uses an interesting and provocative, but I think slightly flawed, philosophical allegory. He explains to you that when he was a young man, he had very poor vision, but he was not yet aware that he had poor vision because he'd never tried using eyeglasses. He'd never been able to compare the limited vision he had to what the world looked like when he put on eyeglasses, and he assumed that everyone else perceived the world in the same slightly blurry way that he did, growing up with impaired vision. And then he had he suddenly realized, how limited his experience of reality was when he finally did get a pair of eyeglasses that corrected his vision. Now, his experience with circumcision, obviously it's a somewhat imperfect parallel, because there is no pair of eyeglasses. There is no way he can restore to himself the contrast in feeling, the experience, the perception of the world, of having those nerve endings working again at the end of his penis, or having the structure and function of the foreskin, the glands, etc., etc. However, I'd invite you to make this comparison instead. And the reason why I'm challenging him on this is that people who take his position, and in very broad brushstrokes, of course, I share his position. For example, I do regard circumcision as a barbarity in modern times that should be abolished, etc. Broadly speaking, I'm in agreement with him. I sympathize with him. However, if you present the claim that this is a devastating procedure that removes 50% of the nerve endings in the penis, that it totally destroys natural sexual function, etc., etc., you have to deal with the confounding evidence, the contrasting point of view of men who have undergone circumcision as teenagers or as adults for various reasons. Once in a while, people do it for health reasons. Once in a while, for religious reasons. For example, people who convert to Islam and then as an adult and then undergo circumcision at that point. We have plenty of witnesses around who will, from their subjective perspective, describe the change as relatively subtle or relatively minor, or will claim, optimistically or not, they may not be lying to themselves or to others, who will claim there's really no difference at all. So how do we reconcile these facts, some of which are obviously objective and quantifiable scientific facts, like about numbers of nerves, which, by the way, is very difficult to quantify if you start looking into the medical literature on that. But in any case, coming up with some notion of the loss of the actual nerve endings, the function of the tissue, etc., etc., and then the subjective experience of what sex is by the minority of people who can have that contrasting experience in the same way that you might with putting on and taking off your glasses. Right now, if you close one eye, if you just shut one eye and have the other eye open, you're seeing with 50% as many nerve endings. And your imagination is filling in the blanks, and you see almost as well. So when I close one eye and I behold the world around me, I don't feel that I'm getting half as much information, that I'm getting half as much experience of reality in terms of detail or vividness of color, or even perspective. I mean, I'm aware it's a scientific fact I'm losing my depth perception when I close one eye, but I can't really tell. I mean, just in the moment, looking around the room, if I close one eye, it's remarkable how well the mind adjusts, how well it creates an illusion of having 100% functionality with only 50% of the nerve endings active. And now, by contrast, I invite you to keep both eyes open, both eyes looking straight ahead, and cover one eye with your hand so that one eye is completely dark, but it's not your eyelid that's closed. Your eyelid is open, and you're blocking the eye with your hand. Isn't that a very different experience? And you'll really notice it if you move your head around if you try to look around the room while having one eye, in this sense, blocked rather than closed. Your mind is now struggling to do just as good a job, to provide you with just as good a perception of the world around you. But you can actually perceive the absence of what would be coming in through your other eye. You have this blacked out image, this blank image, almost interrupting what you're seeing through the other eye. Now, I think the effects of male circumcision are actually comparable to both of these experiences. I think that those of us who are lucky proceed from a situation of really being crippled or disabled in the way that you are when you're covering one eye and that eye is open. We proceed from a situation where the damage done to the tissue and the nerve endings is really hampering our sexuality. The basic function of the penis and the experience through your whole body and what have you. I think that we adapt in the same way that your imagination and mind's eye adapts to simply having one eye closed, where it seems like we're perceiving almost as much, even though we know that we're not. As a simple fact, we know that we're not. Words like retardation and retarded obviously are very loaded, but they're often useful because one of the effects, this has been discussed in literature on circumcision, not just in European culture, not just in Jewish culture, but I've seen this discussed in forms of circumcision, indigenous peoples in Australia, other small groups living on small islands in Southeast Asia, and so on. One of the functions was to delay effective puberty. I don't really mean puberty here, but delay young men becoming sexually active, young men competing for wives, mates, or what have you, competing with older men. So this has been perceived and discussed in anthropological literature. That doesn't mean it's a fact, but it's certainly something that's been discussed in the social sciences. And I think it's fair to say that in adapting, in making the shift from having this kind of impaired vision to having what seems like complete vision, in making that transition, you probably are really delaying men reaching their full sexual maturity, their ability to use their sexuality effectively, by several years. And again, this is, of course, largely just an accident of this bizarre social custom that we're still dragging around in the 21st century. But certainly anthropologists like to talk about it as if it were part of the intended social function, as if it were part of the design, the function that this custom serves within a given tribal society. Again, whether that's Aboriginal Australia, islands of Southeast Asia, or otherwise. I think what Eric Clopper is going up against here is a few different forms of deep-seated prejudice. And one of them is just the type of prejudice that's built into medical expertise itself. So the other day, I think this was just yesterday, I was talking to a medical doctor who is now well known within the vegan demi-monde here. I'm not going to name him, but he's a real medical doctor. My impression is that he's a general practitioner, he's a GP. But obviously there's always excitement when you have a medical doctor who can advocate for veganism as a diet. And he does advocate for ethical veganism, not just for veganism on health grounds or some of this, not just veganism as a way to lose weight and reduce your risk of getting a heart attack or this sort of thing. I was talking to him about the problem discussed on this channel recently of what are SSRI drugs, various classes of so-called antidepressant drugs, what are their effects, and so on. And it was just with unbelievable hubris that he would throw back at me comments such as, quote, I only care about the stats. I don't care at all. I don't give a damn at all about the mechanistic data linked to this. I don't give a damn about the theoretical basis for the health claim, like the theory of what the action is supposed to be or the etiology of the disease. He said repeatedly, I don't give a damn about the underlying condition, that he only cared about the stats, about these numbers indicating efficacy. Now, I think it would be impossible to get him to admit that by the end of the conversation, I had budged his position. I had forced him to reevaluate his dismissal. At that moment, I was laughing because it was so absurd to me. And I said, well, you sound really self-righteous when you say that. You sound really self-righteous when you say you don't care and you don't give a damn. But, you should care. These are ultimately your patients on the line. These are medicines that have impacted the lives of millions of people negatively. And there are class action lawsuits and books published and a lot of expert literature showing the negative impacts these drugs can have and have had. This is not just my opinion. It's had a lot of negative impacts. So we're talking about this, and you're saying so self-righteously that you don't give a damn about, for example, the actual mechanism of action of what happens when you take these drugs. You're just going to look at this statistic in isolation. You don't care about the fact that these drugs were originally marketed and presented to the American public on the basis of a theory that they corrected a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that theory was disproven in the early 1980s. I think the definitive year is 1982. But it continued to be marketed that way. People continue to believe it and take the drugs on that basis. So when you have a drug where the actual, the theory behind its action, the theory claiming that it cures an underlying condition, has been debunked, there are questions about the mechanism, to respond to that by saying, no, I'm just going to look at this one statistic in isolation, and that's all I care about. He's so self-confident because he thinks that's the most scientific position he can take. And from my position, it's laughable because it's pseudoscience masquerading as science, right? And now, ultimately, numbers represent things. I mean, this is no great riddle in scientific literature. And the type of number he's clinging to, or he did at the beginning of the discussion, say by the end of the discussion, I think I'd budged his perception a little bit. I point out, for example, the numbers you're talking about, what do they actually represent? I said most of these studies, you're talking about 3-week evaluation of self-perceived improvement, self-perceived happiness. Like you give someone a drug for 3 weeks and ask them, are you feeling better? That's not really an objective fact, that number, right? There are all kinds of objective facts. And I said, well, measuring how well they're doing at 3 weeks is very different from measuring it after 1 year. And it's very different to measure various objective indicators of what the impact of the drugs have been, as opposed to just subjectively perceived well-being, right? Placebo effect is not the only factor here, but placebo effect is one very real factor. Self-reported subjective well-being or happiness is very, very slippery. And of course, I've dealt with this a lot in my criticism of science applied to Buddhist meditation. You can have someone meditate and ask them, are you feeling better? And then you can generate this as a statistic. You say, oh, they're 2.7 point, they're 8.3 points better on this scale. You can make it look like an objective scientific fact, but this is a completely subjective opinion represented as a number. That's all that's going on here. And the actual number and what's being represented, normally when you get into the footnotes and the details, it starts to come apart. But anyway, even in just pointing out to him the significance of the number of weeks that have passed in these studies, the particular study he had open, like he had a PDF open, I think, while we were talking, was actually a study 8 weeks. So looking at the effects of drugs over 8 weeks. Well, 8 weeks is a lot less than a year, so on and so forth. False opinions rarely last long because everyone takes such a salutary pleasure in refuting them. But false facts can endure for a century and can be highly injurious. And the consensus view on antidepressants is a great example of a false fact or even a constellation of false facts. that people have come to treat as science. When, for me as an outside observer, looking at it with a little bit of detachment, I can see it's laughably pseudoscientific. Laughably so. Likewise, we have a situation where the medical establishment, especially in the United States of America, has assembled a constellation of sort of false facts and reassuring assumptions. And these have come to be regarded as frankly, a form of medical pseudoscientific orthodoxy, which is something much more powerful in the United States of America than either the belief in the Jewish faith or the belief in the Islamic faith. And it certainly has no real coherent relationship to religions like Protestantism and Catholicism in the United States, religions for whom circumcision has simply become something normal without any really clear and coherent dotted line linking it to its biblicity or the authority of the church or what have you. Now, look, I don't think for my regular audience I have to spell this out, but if you're vegan, living in the world as a vegan, you feel that at all times you're surrounded by these sorts of, invisible, is invisible the word I want to use, ubiquitous and yet easily ignored atrocities. I mean, there are all these terrible things going on. Cows are being slaughtered to produce food that's unnecessary, unethical, and unhealthy. There are animals being tortured to death, all around you, in slaughterhouses all around your city, in laboratories, what have you. Devastating impacts for ecology and personal health, and unspeakable, pointless immiseration of these animals themselves. And everyone ignores it, not even because they like it, but because it's normal. And there's a really important contrast here, I'd say, between the passive consumption of meat, people who eat meat because they've never questioned why, and someone who really enjoys hunting, someone who loves the process of hunting down and killing animals, who really sees that as a very positive thing. The vast majority of people who eat meat fall into the passive category. They eat meat and they have no particular reason for eating meat. Their parents did it. They just didn't question it. They grew up in a culture norm. And then you have a small but vocal minority of passionate hunters who are really going to advocate for this. Now, as vegans, we can win if we just convert to veganism. If we even make sympathetic to veganism, those passive meat eaters. Because those are people who, when they see the reality of what's happening at a factory farm, when they just see the reality of millions of tons of cow manure polluting rivers and lakes and oceans, they can look at that and say, wow, it's not worth it. And someone who's maybe deeply committed to a certain ideology as a hunter, that same person may go and visit a slaughterhouse, and they may really feel, yes, this is worth it. They may feel that this is their ideology, that they would subscribe to. They would valorize this culture of millions of people remaining dependent on billions of animals dying every year. Now, in the same way, in terms of the future discourse surrounding circumcision, you have a very, very small minority of people who actually like this, who actually feel positively about this operation. And the vast majority of people are going through the motions the same way that people will mindlessly go and buy a hamburger at McDonald's without thinking about what it is they're buying, without thinking about the ecological consequences, the ethical consequences. I think it's important to have the detachment and maturity to realize that the circumcision debate can win just by addressing and converting those people, the people who are passively participating in the custom of genital mutilation, not the people who are really avid, true believers in it. And the people who are passively participating, that definitely includes the vast majority of Jews, the vast majority of people who are culturally Jewish, people like Jerry Seinfeld, people who are not Orthodox Jews, but who simply happen to be born in the Jewish faith. The vast majority of them also can be convinced to come over to an anti-circumcision position easily enough. And when you get the majority of those people at least sympathizing with your position, you have won. Now, I think that is a perspective that Eric Clopper is lacking. I'm going to give the link to his video below this video, and you guys can see it for yourself and join your conclusions. I could in future do a critique of his video. I could make a separate video here talking about what I disagree with, where I think he stepped off the right path. But even in this one comment, you can see that I'm drawing attention to the fact that he is choosing to really antagonize and target that small hardcore of true believers, the tiny percentage of people who really think that circumcision is a good idea, as opposed to reaching out to and bringing onto his side that much larger public who are indifferent to the issue and who, with just a little bit of education and outreach, can at least be made sympathetic to, if not avid supporters of, an anti-circumcision position as a basic question of human rights. Okay, guys, to be honest with you, I think I had about 5 or 6 more topics to cover in this video, but we're past the 20 minutes mark, so for right now, that's a wrap. You can support my channel on Patreon for $1 a month. I know I have just a couple of supporters who really want to talk to me more about this issue, about the future of circumcision, or, I don't know, anti-circumcision activism. I think overall, if you're looking at the Eric Clopper experience, this latest controversy of him presenting his thesis and a live lecture, and then he was fired from his position at Harvard University because he dared to make this, somewhat offensive political statement against circumcision. This is obviously going to be the biggest topic discussed in this for quite some time. I can ask some of the same questions about this that I ask about vegan activism. I don't think the way to address this is with a mood of hatred, anger, or a sense of injustice. And that's exactly what Eric Clopper chooses to summon on stage to give this dramatic performance. There's a lot of hate and anguish, there's a lot of anger, and there's a sense of trying to take revenge against injustice in his performance. In a much more sublimated and subtle way, within veganism, there are leaders like Earthling Ed who also say that and demonstrate that. I listened to a lecture just the other day, I think yesterday, from Earthling Ed, and he was really talking about hatred and rage and anger and how he felt it was important to stay in touch with that as a vegan activist when you're doing this kind of outreach. I was listening to that thinking, wow, I could edit this together with what I say about doing outreach and education, the importance I put on love, what I call cold love, having a cold, detached form of love in your outreach. And I could say, wow, here's Earthling Ed. His philosophy is like the exact opposite of mine, like 180 degrees the opposite of mine. It's interesting here. So in the same way, I could say someone like Eric Clopper or someone doing this kind of outreach and activism, you have to find a way to do it that's based in love. And again, not just love for the hapless victims, but it's difficult to describe. I just did a video talking about this. Love in the sense of you're reaching out to help the person you're preaching to because you're confident that what you're preaching is for their own benefit, that you are actually helping them. You're not just rebuking them or insulting them. You're not just denigrating them or letting them know how ethically inferior they are to you. You feel confident that if they knew what you know, rationally, they would come to the same conclusions that you'd come to, and that you are, in a very fundamental sense, helping them to be a better person by giving them that option and opportunity. There's a kind of love there where I can reach out to someone who's been a meat eater their whole life and a hunter, and I can say to them, look, here are the facts. Now, what kind of person do you want to be? And I can certainly reach out to someone who has supported circumcision, male genital mutilation, someone who's supported that custom their whole lives. And I can say to them, hey, these are the consequences. This is the scientific reality. This is the historical background. And now you have to take responsibility for your own decisions in life. You have to look in the mirror and ask, what kind of person do you want to be? And as difficult as it may be to muster an attitude of detachment and compassion and even love for the people you're educating, that is exactly what you've got to do. And if you can't do that, I think you've got to get off stage, because when you do it out of a sense of anger and hatred, frustration, revenge, injustice, wanting revenge for an injustice, I think you discredit your own movement, you discredit yourself, and, to be blunt, you also soon enough bring yourself to the brink of insanity. And I see that with many vegan activists who do drive themselves crazy with veganism, normally over a couple of years, but it catches up. And, I think it'll deserve to be asked about Eric Clopper, who's now promising to have a long career dedicated to lobbying government on this issue. Either he's going to change tactics, partly for his own sanity and partly to do outreach and education more effectively, i.e. he's going to drop this, mantle of resentment and anger and hatred, or he's going to drive himself crazy. And I realize it's partly for theatrical reasons that he's doing this, but I don't have to name names. There are plenty of people here in the vegan movement where you can pretend they're just doing this for theatrical reasons. But ultimately, the question we have to ask is not merely if someone acts insane, but if their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors betoken that they really are insane. Politics itself is in large part a performance, and I do regard Eric Clopper as someone who is struggling to make the transition from being something like a professor of physics was his field, to being a performer and to being a politician. I think now the whole world is going to watch as he takes the next step from his one-man play, from this emotional meltdown on stage, to what I hope is a more cerebral, positive, and engaged future that may indeed be, a significant step as Western culture, Christian, Jewish, and Islamic culture, start to challenge the assumptions of millennia about male genital mutilation.